Godwyn the Golden did not simply die, and the more you look at the exact circumstances of that death, the more it starts to look like the single most consequential, most carefully obscured, and most quietly terrifying event in the entire history of the Lands Between. Before we get into it, drop a comment and let me know where in the world you're watching this from and what time it is right where you are. I always like seeing how far this channel reaches, and it genuinely helps if you type it out now before you get pulled into the video, because 3 hours from now you might not remember. So go ahead, comment your city or country and the time on your clock, and then let's get into this. Because what I want to walk through today isn't just how did Godwyn die. That part on the surface seems almost simple. Everyone who has played Elden Ring knows the basic shape of it. Godwyn, the Golden Lord, the demigod who was supposedly untouchable, who carried destined death itself sealed away inside him, was killed. Killed permanently. Not defeated. Not wounded. Killed in a way that no demigod before him had ever been killed. In a way that broke something in the fabric of the Lands Between that has never been repaired. But when you actually sit with the details, when you pull apart who did it, how they did it, what tools they used, what the immediate aftermath looked like, and what Marika did in the hours, days, and years afterward, the story stops looking like a tragic death scene and starts looking like something closer to a controlled demolition. Something that was allowed to happen, or at least not prevented when it could have been. Something that served a purpose far larger than the death of one golden sun. That's the theory I want to walk you through today, piece by piece, using what the game actually shows us, what the item descriptions actually say, and what the environmental storytelling actually implies. I'm not going to claim any of this is confirmed canon, because Elden Ring almost never gives you that certainty. What I can do is lay out the evidence, follow the threads where they lead, and let you decide how far you're willing to go with me. So let's start at the beginning. Let's start with who Godwyn actually was before any of this happened. Godwyn was the eldest son of Queen Marika the Eternal and Godfrey, the first Elden Lord. Among all of Marika's children, and there were many, scattered across bloodlines and unions we're still piecing together, Godwyn held a specific kind of status. He wasn't just powerful, he was beloved. Multiple item descriptions and NPC accounts describe him with a kind of warmth that's almost never extended to the other demigods. Millennia, brilliant and tragic as she is spoken of with awe and pity. Radon is spoken of with a kind of grim respect, a general's reverence. Rykard is spoken of, frankly, with disgust. But Godwyn is spoken of with love. He's called golden not just because of his hair or his bearing, but because something about him seemed to genuinely embody the light the Golden Order claimed to represent. And this matters enormously for what comes later, because it means Godwyn's death wasn't just the loss of a powerful demigod in a succession war. It was the loss of what the Golden Order held up as its purest symbol. If you wanted to design the single most devastating blow you could land against Marika's entire religious and political structure, killing Godwyn, killing him permanently, in a way that couldn't be explained away, might be exactly it. Godwyn held something else too. Something that on the surface seems like a blessing and in hindsight looks like a curse. He was the vessel, or at least closely tied to the concept, of what the game calls the absence of death within the Golden Order. Death itself, the actual rune of death, destined death, had been removed from the Elden Ring by Marika and Godfrey generations earlier, and sealed away specifically, so that the golden lineage, her children, her order, her world, would never have to experience true death. They could be defeated. They could be maimed, transformed, driven mad. But they could not die. Not really. Not permanently. This is one of the most important pieces of context for understanding why Godwyn's death is so uniquely horrifying, and it's worth sitting with for a moment, because I don't think the game spells it out clearly on a first playthrough. Every demigod who fights you in a boss arena in some sense should not be capable of dying the way a normal creature dies. Death itself was locked away, removed from the ring. This is explicitly why the world of the Lands Between is full of the eternal, the undying, the things that should have ended long ago but simply keep going in some diminished, rotted, or repeating form. It's why the Erdtree burns corpses into ash rather than letting them properly die and pass on. It's why so many of the enemies you fight throughout your entire journey are, in a sense, already dead and simply haven't been allowed to stop. Godwyn was born into that world. A world that had specifically, deliberately engineered itself to be free of death's finality. And then Godwyn became the one demigod who died anyway, not defeated in some symbolic or metaphysical sense that could be reinterpreted or explained through the Golden Order's mythology, but killed. outright, permanently, his soul severed from his body in a way that even the absence of death in the Elden Ring could not undo. That's the wound. That's the injury that the rest of the story pivots around. Not just a death, but the first true death the world had witnessed in generations, happening to the one figure the entire order held up as beloved and golden and pure. Now let's talk about how it happened, because the how is where things get genuinely disturbing. The killers were Ranni, Rykard, and the assassin known as Bled. No, hold on, let's be precise here, because getting this exactly right matters. The plot to kill Godwyn is most directly tied to Ranni the Witch and her co-conspirators, and it's carried out through the Black Knife Assassins, a shadowy order of killers who wielded weapons infused with the power of destined death itself. One of these assassins in this specific act drove a blade, a black knife, imbued with the essence of death that had been sealed away from the world, directly into Godwyn. Think about the layered horror of that for a second. The very thing that had been removed from the world specifically so that beings like Godwyn could never die was reintroduced, weaponized, and used to kill him. Someone had to have access to that sealed-away concept of destined death, had to be able to shape it into a physical weapon capable of piercing a demigod's body and severing his soul from it permanently, and had to be willing to use it on the most beloved of Mareka's children. The Black Knife Assassins themselves are one of the more unsettling background factions in the entire game. They're rarely seen. Their weapons, the Black Knives, are described as blades that carry the concept of death within them, capable of killing beings that should otherwise be unkillable. Where does that power come from? Some interpretations point to Malekith, the Black Blade, the demigod who serves as the shadow of Godfrey, and who is tasked, according to some readings, with wielding and guarding destined death itself after it was removed from the ring. If that's the case, then the weapon used to kill Godwyn didn't come from some rogue independent source. It came from within the highest circles of the Golden Order's own inner mechanisms. The concept of death, guarded by one of the most loyal and severe of Mareka's own instruments, somehow made its way into the hands of assassins working for Ranni, and was used to kill Mareka's own son. That should stop you in your tracks a little, because it means the tool used to commit what should be the single most unforgivable act against the Golden Order, the murder of its golden favorite, came from inside the Order's own vault of secrets. Somebody let that knife out. Somebody allowed destined death, sealed away for the express purpose of protecting people like Godwyn, to end up in exactly the hands that would use it against him. Let's sit with the location for a moment too, because where this happened matters just as much as how. Godwyn was killed at what is now called the Deathbed Dream, sometimes tied to the region we know as the site of his passing near the Mistwood and the roots of the Erdtree, or according to other interpretations, an event that unfolds in a kind of liminal dreamlike space that exists apart from ordinary time and geography. The game gives us access to a location literally called the Deathbed Dream, a dream world you can enter later, where you witness a frozen, looping vision of the moment of his death. It's an eerie, silent, golden-hued space, populated by dream versions of Ranni, Rykard, Radon, and others, all standing near Godwyn's dying body, caught in a moment that never resolves and never ends. The fact that this scene exists at all, the fact that it's preserved, almost enshrined, as a dream that can still be entered and walked through generations later, tells you something. This wasn't a death that happened and was buried and forgotten. It was a wound that stayed open. A moment that kept replaying, kept being revisited, kept being significant enough that its psychic or spiritual echo persisted in a form the player can literally walk into. And who do we find in that dream? Not enemies rushing in for a killing blow, not chaos, not battle. We find a strange stillness. Ranni is there, calm, present, seemingly aware of what's happening and unbothered by it, in a way that reads less like grief and more like resolve. Rykard is there. Radon is there. Multiple demigods, present, in the room, at the moment their own brother was killed, and doing nothing to stop it. That's the detail I want you to hold on to as we go forward, because it's going to come up again and again throughout this video. The demigods were there. They didn't intervene. Some of them may have actively helped plan it. This wasn't an outside enemy infiltrating the golden lineage and murdering one of their own in secret. This was, at least in part, an inside job, carried out with the tacit or active cooperation of Godwyn's own siblings. Why would they do that? Why would Ranni, Rykard, and possibly others conspire, or at minimum stand by and allow, the murder of their own brother, the most beloved of all of them? Using a weapon smuggled out of the Golden Order's own arsenal of sealed death? This is where the story stops being a simple murder mystery and starts becoming something much bigger. A story about what several of Mareka's children had already concluded about the nature of the world they were living in, and what they were willing to do to break it. Let's back up and talk about the state of the Golden Order before Godwyn's death, because understanding the why requires understanding what the demigods were reacting against. The Golden Order, as established by Marika and the Erdtree, was built on a foundation of controlled eternity, death removed from the ring, order imposed from above. A hierarchy of tarnished who were exiled and stripped of their grace specifically to prevent them from ever challenging the Golden Lineage's claim to the Elden Ring. A caste system, essentially, in which some beings were destined to rule eternally and others were cast out to wander, forgotten, until they were needed again. For centuries, this held. The world was, by the Golden Order's own definition, orderly, but order and health are not the same thing. And there's substantial evidence scattered throughout item descriptions and environmental storytelling that the world under the Golden Order, even before the Shattering, was already rotting from within. The Frenzied Flame existed as a rejected, feared alternative philosophy, worshipped in the depths by outcasts who saw the sealed nature of the Golden Order as a kind of prison. The Scarlet Rot festered in Caelid even before the war that would later devastate it further, hinting that millennia's affliction was not something that emerged only after Godwyn's death, but had roots stretching back earlier. The Erdtree's insistence on burning the dead to ash rather than letting them pass on had already created a world full of the undying, the incomplete, the things that lingered in half-states because true death had been taken from them. In other words, the world Godwyn was born the golden favorite of was already sick. Ranni, sharp and perceptive as she's characterized to be across every piece of dialogue and item description we have access to, seems to have understood this earlier and more clearly than almost anyone else in her generation. Her entire arc, her rejection of her own fate as a potential Elden Lord successor, her desire to shatter the Elden Ring and usher in a new Age of Stars free from the Golden Order's grip, reads as a direct response to having grown up inside a system she recognized as fundamentally broken, fundamentally coercive, fundamentally built on a foundation of denied death and enforced eternity that was, slowly poisoning everything it touched. If Ranni believed, and there's strong evidence she did, that the only way to break the Golden Order's grip on the world was to shatter the Elden Ring itself, then she needed a catalyst. The Elden Ring, as it existed under Mareka's rule, was stable specifically because death had been removed from it. A world without true death is, in a strange way, a world that cannot be broken the same way a mortal world can, because nothing within it can ever fully end. To shatter something that stable, you might need to reintroduce the one force capable of causing permanent, irreversible rupture, destined death itself. And what better way to reintroduce destined death into the world than to use it? To actually use it, physically, violently, against the most golden, most beloved, most untouchable symbol the Golden Order had? Not just symbolically breaking the taboo, but demonstrating in the most visceral way imaginable that permanent death was back, that nothing was safe from it anymore, not even Marika's favorite son. If this reading is correct, and again, I want to stress that Elden Ring's lore almost never confirms anything this directly, so we're reasoning from implication and pattern, not certainty, then Godwyn wasn't killed out of hatred, or rivalry, or even primarily as a political maneuver in a succession dispute. He was killed as an act of sabotage against the entire metaphysical structure of the world. His death wasn't the goal. His death was the mechanism. The actual goal was what his death would set in motion. And what it set in motion was catastrophic on a scale that I don't think gets fully appreciated on a first playthrough, because the game shows you the aftermath in fragments, scattered across dozens of item descriptions, environmental details, and offhand lines of dialogue. And it takes deliberately piecing them together to see the full shape of what actually happened next. So let's start piecing it together. Let's talk about what happened in the immediate aftermath of Godwyn's death, to his body, to his soul, and to the world around him, because this is where the story goes from tragic to genuinely disturbing. Godwyn's body did not simply lie down and die the way a mortal body does. Because he was a demigod, because his flesh was suffused with the golden power of the Erdtree and the divine inheritance of Marika's bloodline, his body kept going after the black knife severed his soul. This is one of the most quietly horrifying pieces of implied lore in the entire game, and it doesn't get spoken aloud anywhere. You have to assemble it from item descriptions and from what you actually see when you visit certain locations. The Rune of Death cut Godwyn's soul away from his physical form, But his body, being what it was, didn't simply collapse into a corpse. It kept existing in some undying, rotting, animate state. Think about what that actually means. Not he died and his body decayed normally. His body kept functioning, kept persisting, kept being physically present in the world, in some liminal condition between alive and dead, precisely because true death, the thing that had just been used to kill him, still wasn't something his golden flesh could fully accept. Even the weapon that killed him couldn't fully claim him. It severed his soul but left something behind, something that lingered. This is, I think, one of the most disturbing implications in all of Elden Ring, and it doesn't get nearly enough attention. Godwyn wasn't just murdered. He was murdered in a way that left his body as a kind of wound in the world, present, physical, real, but hollowed of the soul that should have animated it. And yet not properly dead either. A body without a self, persisting because the mechanisms of the world it inhabited had no category for what had just happened to it. Where did this body go? This is where things get environmentally significant, because the roots of the Erdtree itself, which spread beneath the entirety of the lands between, and which you traverse for hours throughout your playthrough in areas like the Deathroot depths, are tied directly to Godwyn. If you make your way deep enough into the Deathroot depths, following the path beneath Lindell, you eventually find him, his body, preserved, or rather trapped, entangled in the roots of the Erdtree itself, in a location that feels less like a tomb and more like something being slowly absorbed. And it's not just his body sitting there quietly. When you reach him, you find that his corpse has essentially become the seed, the source, the anchor point for an entire secondary demigod boss encounter. The Regal Ancestor Spirit, or, depending on how you've progressed the story, the fight against Mohg's influence over Godwyn's remains, culminating in the horrifying Godwyn the Golden Boss fight itself, where his corpse, animated and twisted, rises as an undead, decaying king wreathed in the visual language of death and rot, his golden light corrupted into something closer to a plague. Sit with that image for a second. The most beloved, golden, symbolically pure of all the demigods, whose death was supposed to represent the ultimate taboo-breaking act, ends up as a rotting corpse tangled in the roots beneath his mother's capital, eventually rising as a grotesque, corrupted engine of decay that the player has to fight off. That's not incidental. That's not just video game needs a boss fight, so let's reuse this character. That's the game telling you, visually and mechanically, exactly what kind of horror Godwyn's death actually represents. Golden purity, rotted from the inside, because it was never allowed to properly end. Now, why is his body there specifically, tangled in the Erdtree's roots? Because the Erdtree itself is deeply physically tied to death and to the absence of death throughout the entire game. Remember, the Erdtree burns the dead. This is one of the very first things the game establishes, in the opening cinematic, where we see grace and burial and the Erdtree's fire consuming bodies rather than letting them properly decompose or pass on. The Erdtree's roots reach into and through death itself, into the underground, into the space beneath the world where the old, forgotten, and dead things go. Godwyn's rotting, soulless body being drawn down into those roots isn't just convenient geography, it's thematically precise. The Erdtree, the symbol of the Golden Order's control over death and eternity, ends up literally consuming and entangling the body of the one figure whose death broke that very control. It's almost as if the Erdtree itself is trying and failing to process something it has no mechanism to process. A true death, finally happening within a system that was built specifically to prevent true death from ever occurring again. And this is where the rot comes in, literally, mechanically, in terms of what the game shows you. Scarlet Rot. If you've played Elden Ring, you know Scarlet Rot as one of the most feared, most devastating afflictions in the entire game. Caelid, an entire region, has been reduced to a diseased crimson wasteland by it. Malenia, one of the most powerful demigods, is permanently infected by it, to the point where her entire moveset and character arc revolve around trying to survive and eventually weaponize a disease that's slowly consuming her from within. Here's the detail that connects everything. There is substantial evidence, scattered across item descriptions for things like the Rotten Breath incantation, the Bloodrose, and various environmental storytelling beats in the Deathroot depths in Caelid, suggesting that Scarlet Rot is directly connected to Godwyn, either originating from him or being deeply intertwined with the aftermath of his death and the corruption of his body beneath the Erdtree. Think about the layered horror of this. Godwyn's death didn't just remove a demigod from the world. It potentially seeded, or at minimum catastrophically worsened, one of the most devastating plagues in the entire setting, a disease that would go on to ravage an entire region, drive millennia to the edge of losing herself entirely, and become one of the single greatest threats the lands between has ever faced. A death that was supposed to be a singular, contained political and metaphysical event ended up leaking outward into the world as literal physical corruption, rot spreading from the wound that killing him left behind. This is why I keep coming back to the idea that Godwyn's death isn't just sad. It's structurally catastrophic in a way the game never explains to you directly, but shows you piece by piece if you're willing to follow the trail. His death didn't just break a taboo, it appears to have introduced a literal spreading, world-altering disease into the lands between. A disease that is still actively devastating entire regions by the time the player arrives, generations later. Now let's talk about Marika, because her reaction, or rather, the deliberate absence of a visible reaction, is maybe the single most chilling piece of this entire story. You would expect, wouldn't you, that the death of your most beloved child, killed in an unprecedented and horrifying way that broke fundamental laws of your own religious and metaphysical order, would provoke some kind of visible, dramatic, world-shaking response from a being as powerful as Marika. War, public mourning, a hunt for the killers. Something. Instead, what we get is silence, followed by fracture. According to the timeline the game gradually reveals, Marika's response to Godwyn's death was not a unified, singular reaction. It was fragmentation. At some point, either as a direct consequence of Godwyn's death, or closely tied to it in the broader unraveling of the Golden Order, Marika shattered the Elden Ring herself. This is the event that gives the game its name, and that defines the entire state of the world you're exploring, the Shattering. The ring that held reality together, that enforced the Golden Order's control over death, decay, and succession, was broken. Broken by Marika, her own hand. Why would the one being with the most to lose from the Golden Order's collapse be the one to shatter it herself? This is where the theory I want to walk you through gets its sharpest edge, and it's the part that I think genuinely reframes everything about Godwyn's death once you sit with it. What if Marika didn't just fail to prevent Godwyn's death? What if, on some level, she allowed it? What if she needed it to happen? Let's slow down here because this is a heavy claim, and I want to build it carefully rather than just asserting it. We know several things for certain, or as close to certain as Elden Ring's lore ever gets. We know Marika and Radagon are in some sense the same being. Two aspects, two identities, inhabiting or connected to a single divine essence. This is confirmed through numerous item descriptions, and through the direct revelation late in the game that Radagon is Marika, or at least so fused with her that the distinction becomes almost meaningless by the time you reach the end of the story. We know Marika had multiple consorts and multiple sets of children across different points in what seems to be an impossibly long life. Children with Godfrey, the first Elden Lord, including Godwyn, Morgott, and Mohg, among others, and children as Radagon with Rennala, Queen of the Full Moon, including Ranni, Rykard, and Radon. We know that Marika, at some point, orchestrated a war, the answer to which questions the entire structure of demigod succession, apparently designed to have her children fight and thin their own ranks. We know that Marika, according to some of the more direct implications in the game's final act, may have been planning the Shattering, or at least anticipating the necessity of it, for a very long time before it actually happened. And we know that Marika's ultimate hidden goal, the thing that the endgame reveals as her true motivation, was to destroy the Golden Order she herself had built, to find some way to break the cycle of enforced eternity, denied death, and rigid hierarchy that she had spent centuries constructing and enforcing. Her final message, delivered through Radagon's fragmented psyche near the end of the game, expresses something close to regret, or at least exhaustion, a desire for a new Elden Lord to arise who will do what she herself could not fully accomplish, change the world, remake the Order, allow it to become something other than the Frozen. Controlling structures she had spent an age building and maintaining. If Marika had already come to see the Golden Order she built as a prison, not just for the tarnished she exiled, not just for the lesser beings crushed beneath the demigod's rule, but for herself, for her own children, trapped in an artificial eternity that prevented them from ever truly growing, changing, or ending. Then Godwyn's death takes on an entirely different meaning. Because remember what we established earlier, death itself had been removed from the Elden Ring specifically by Marika and Godfrey. She was the one who took it out. She was the one who built the system in which nothing could ever truly permanently end. If she later came to see that system as a mistake, as something that needed to be undone in order for the world to have any chance of genuine change, then she, more than anyone else in the lands between, would have understood exactly what was needed to break it. Not more war. Not more conquest. Death, actual, permanent, world-shaking death, reintroduced into a system that had specifically excluded it. And who would be the most devastating, most symbolically total demonstration of death's return? Not some minor NPC, not some background soldier. The Golden One, the favorite, the purest symbol the Golden Order had of its own eternal, untouchable perfection. I'm not going to sit here and tell you Marika personally ordered the hit on her own son. The game doesn't give us that directly. And I want to be honest about the limits of what we can actually claim here. What we can say with much more confidence is that Marika did nothing to prevent it, despite being, by every measure the game gives us, powerful enough to have prevented almost anything. And in the aftermath, rather than seeking vengeance, rather than punishing Ranni and Rykard and whichever other demigods were complicit or present, she did something else entirely. She shattered the Elden Ring herself and effectively vanished from active rule, leaving the lands between to descend into the fractured, warring, decaying state you spend the entire game exploring. If Godwyn's death was, functionally, the crack that let Marika justify, or force, the shattering, then her silence afterward isn't confusion or grief paralysis. It's closer to completion. The thing she needed to happen, happened, and now the slow, agonizing process of the old order's collapse could finally begin. This is why I keep describing Godwyn's death as more terrifying than it first appears. It's not just that a beloved character died in a shocking way. It's that his death may have been, on some level, sacrificial. Not in the sense of a willing sacrifice on his part, because nothing in the game suggests Godwyn wanted this or agreed to it, but sacrificial in the sense that his life was. Whether he knew it or not, the price required to break a system that had trapped an entire world in artificial, rotting eternity. He didn't choose to be that price. It was taken from him, using a weapon smuggled out of his own family's most guarded secrets while his siblings watched. And this brings us to another deeply unsettling wrinkle in the story. What happened to Godwyn's soul after his body was severed from it? Because in the world of Elden Ring, souls, or more precisely, the runes and essence that constitute a demigod's power, don't simply vanish. They go somewhere. They're taken, absorbed, hoarded, fought over. So where did Godwyn's soul go? The most direct answer the game gives us involves Mohg the Omen, one of Marika and Godfrey's other children, a demigod born deformed and omen, marked from birth as something the Golden Order considered impure, hidden away and denied his birthright specifically because of how he looked. Mohg's entire character arc is built around obsession, resentment, and a desperate desire to claim power and legitimacy that the Golden Order denied him purely because of his appearance. And Mohg, it turns out, has spent an unknown span of time doing something extraordinarily disturbing, attempting to seize Godwyn's remains, his blood, his flesh, the lingering essence of his soulless but undying body, and use it as the foundation for his own twisted ritual. Deep beneath Lindell, in the area known as the Mohgwyn Palace, accessible through the consecrated snowfield's cocoon of the Empyrean, Mohg has been harvesting Godwyn's blood, using it to fuel an entire cult of blood-worshipping followers, and preparing a ritual intended to have Godwyn's remains serve as the vessel for a horrifying union, an attempt to force an Empyrean. A being capable of hosting the power of a new Elden Ring into a monstrous marriage with Godwyn's corrupted remains, creating what the game refers to, in deeply unsettling terms, as the Formless Mother, a Lord of Blood born from this union. I want you to sit with the layers of violation happening here. Godwyn is murdered. His body, unable to properly die because of the very system built to prevent death, lingers in a rotting, undead state. And then one of his own brothers, one of the family members closest to him in blood, an omen shunned and despised by the same golden hierarchy Godwyn represented, finds his remains and begins systematically harvesting them, draining his blood, using his body as raw material for an entirely separate grotesque bid for power. Godwyn doesn't get to rest. He doesn't get to properly die. He becomes a resource, a well that Mohg drinks from generation after generation to fuel his own cult and his own twisted ambitions. This is, I think, the detail that turns Godwyn's death from a singular tragic event into something closer to an ongoing atrocity. It's not just that he died. It's that his death opened a wound that never closed, and that wound has been actively, deliberately exploited by his own family in the time since. Every drop of blood Mohg's cult venerates, every ritual they perform in his crimson-lit palace is drawn from the corpse of a demigod who was murdered using a weapon that should never have existed in the first place, whose body couldn't properly die because the world had specifically been engineered to prevent death, and who has spent however many years since being slowly, systematically consumed by one of his own siblings. Let's talk more about that palace, and about what Mohg has actually built there, because it deepens the horror even further. Quick reminder before we go further, if you haven't already, drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. I like scrolling back through these later and seeing just how spread out this audience actually is. And it's a nice thing to look back on. Now, back to Mohgwyn Palace. Mohgwyn Palace, when you finally reach it, is one of the most visually and tonally distinct locations in the entire game, and I don't think that's an accident. Everywhere else in the lands between, even in its most decayed and broken state, still carries traces of the golden aesthetic the Erdtree and the Golden Order impose. Soft light, pale stone, gold accents even in ruin. Mohgwyn Palace rejects all of that entirely. It's soaked in red, blood-colored skies, blood-colored architecture, an atmosphere that feels less like a royal palace and more like the inside of a wound that's been left open and worshipped rather than healed. The entire location is built around and sustained by an enormous cascading river of blood. Blood that, according to the implications scattered through the area in its item descriptions, originates from Godwyn's body itself, specifically from the location deep within the Deathroot depths where his remains are entangled in the Erdtree's roots. Mohg has somehow tapped into this, diverted it, turned his brother's endless, undying, unstoppable bleeding into a literal geographic feature. A river that never runs dry, because the source, Godwyn's body, can't actually finish dying and therefore can't stop bleeding. Think about what that means on a purely mechanical level. Godwyn isn't just dead, but not dead in some abstract metaphysical sense. His body is, right now, at every point during your playthrough, continuously bleeding, feeding an entire river system. Because death was removed from the world specifically to prevent this kind of ending, and his body has nowhere else for that unresolved violence to go. It just keeps flowing. Indefinitely, there's something almost unbearably sad buried inside that horror. The idea that even in whatever remains of him, Godwyn is still being drained, still giving. Still golden in the sense that his blood still nourishes something, except now what it nourishes is a cult built on his own violation. Mohg's followers, the Bloodlord's Knights, and Mohg's various cultists that you fight throughout the area, worship this blood directly. They bathe in it. Their armor and weapons are stained with it. Their entire theology, as far as we can piece together from item descriptions and their behavior, treats Godwyn's endless bleeding as a kind of miracle, a divine outpouring, rather than what it actually is. The ongoing, unresolved trauma of a murder that the world's own rules won't allow to properly conclude. And at the center of all this, Mohg is preparing his ritual. If you follow the Var questline or explore this area at the point where the story allows, you find that Mohg intends to use Godwyn's remains, and the blood that flows from them, as the foundation for creating a new god-like entity, the Formless Mother, by forcibly binding an Empyrean, one of the rare beings capable of hosting the power of a new Elden Ring, into a monstrous union with what's left of their murdered brother. There's a version of this that almost plays out, depending on how the player navigates certain questlines, an attempt to force this union using the player character or an NPC as the sacrificial component, dragged down to Mohgwyn Palace bound and subjected to a ritual that the game frames, visually and tonally, as something between a wedding and an execution. It's deeply, deliberately uncomfortable to witness. Mohg isn't just performing dark magic for the sake of power in some abstract sense. He's trying to force his way into legitimacy, into godhood, into the kind of recognition the Golden Order always denied him for being an omen. And he's doing it by weaponizing his own dead brother's body as the raw material. This, I think, is the second major layer of horror in Godwyn's story, not just what was done to him in the moment of his death, but what continues to be done to him afterward, indefinitely, by his own family, because the specific way he died left him in a state where this kind of ongoing violation was even possible. A normal death would have ended things. Godwyn's body would have decayed, been buried or burned, and that would have been the end of it, horrible as the murder itself already was. But because death was absent from the world, because his body couldn't fully accept its own ending, he became something else, an eternal wound, endlessly exploitable, endlessly bleeding. endlessly available to be drawn from by whoever was ruthless enough to try. Let's widen the lens again for a moment, because I want to bring in another piece of this puzzle that I think doesn't get discussed nearly as much as it should. The connection between Godwyn's death and Malenia's affliction with scarlet rot, and by extension, the entire devastation of Caelid. We touched on this earlier, the implication that scarlet rot is connected to, possibly originating from, the corruption surrounding Godwyn's death and his rotting, undying body beneath the Erdtree. Let's go deeper into what that actually means for Malenia specifically, because her story, when placed next to Godwyn's, becomes almost unbearably tragic. Malenia, Blade of Miquella, is one of the most powerful and most beloved demigods in the entire cast, twin sister to Miquella, the kind and gentle demigod whose entire arc revolves around trying to protect and eventually save her. From a young age, Malenia was afflicted by scarlet rot, a disease that slowly consumes and transforms the body, in which she has spent her entire life fighting, suppressing, and ultimately learning to weaponize rather than simply succumb to. Her boss fight, when you eventually face her, is built around this exact horror, a demigod at war with her own body, capable of unleashing devastating, uncontrolled blooms of rot when pushed to her limits, fighting not just you, but the disease itself, live, in real time, in front of you. If scarlet rot's origins are tied to the corruption seeping out from Godwyn's death, either literally originating from his rotting body beneath the Erdtree, or metaphysically connected to the broader wound his death opened in the world's fabric, then Malenia's entire life of suffering becomes another direct casualty of the exact same event we've been discussing this whole video. Not just Mohg exploiting Godwyn's remains for his own gain, not just the Erdtree left unable to process an unprecedented true death, but an entirely separate demigod, one who had nothing directly to do with the assassination, spending her whole life battling a disease that may trace directly back to the wound her brother's murder left in the world. This is part of why I keep insisting Godwyn's death is more terrifying and more consequential than a first playthrough tends to reveal. It's not contained. It's not a single tragic event that resolves and lets the story move on. It radiates outward. It becomes Mohg's cult and his blood river. It becomes potentially the scarlet rot devastating Caelid and slowly consuming Malenia from within. It becomes the instability that eventually forces Mareka's hand toward the shattering, plunging the entire lands between into the fractured, warring state you spend the whole game trying to navigate and eventually resolve. One death, one assassination, carried out with a weapon that shouldn't have existed, in front of family members who did nothing to stop it, using power smuggled out of the Golden Order's own most closely guarded secrets. And from that single point, an entire world's worth of consequence spirals outward, still unresolved by the time the player arrives, generations later, to pick through the wreckage. Let's talk now about what this means for the broader question of destined death itself, and about Malekith's role in all of this. Because I think there's a strong case to be made that the entire structure of the endgame, the final confrontation with destined death, the ultimate choice the player has to make about what kind of new order to build, is directly, inescapably shaped by what happened to Godwyn generations earlier. Let's talk about Malekith, because I think he's one of the most underappreciated figures in this entire chain of events, and his role in the story only makes sense once you understand what he was tasked with protecting in the first place. Malekith, the Black Blade, is described across multiple item texts and environmental cues as the shadow of Godfrey, not a son in the conventional sense that Godwyn, Morgott, or Mohg are sons, but something closer to a fragment or reflection of Godfrey's own martial spirit, given form and purpose. His purpose, specifically, was to serve as the guardian of destined death after it was removed from the Elden Ring. He was the one entrusted with keeping that power sealed, contained, away from the world, precisely so that no one, not even the demigods themselves, could access it and use it the way it was ultimately used against Godwyn. Malekith fails at this task, whether through negligence, deception, or some deliberate choice we're never shown directly. The power of destined death makes its way out of his keeping and into the hands of the Black Knife assassins, who use it to kill Godwyn. This is, I think, one of the quieter tragedies buried in this whole story. Malekith isn't a villain in the way Mohg or Rykard are villains. Everything we see of him in the present timeline suggests someone consumed by guilt, discipline, and grim duty. A figure trying, desperately and somewhat hopelessly, to hold together a broken oath. When you finally encounter him deep beneath the Erdtree, guarding destined death once again, He doesn't behave like a mastermind reveling in power. He behaves like someone serving a sentence. And the fight against Malekith, when you eventually face him, isn't framed as a straightforward villain encounter either. It's framed as almost a mercy. A demigod who has been guarding an unbearable secret and an unbearable failure for who knows how many years, finally facing a challenger capable of ending his vigil one way or another. Beating Malekith doesn't feel triumphant in the way beating Radahn or Rykard does. It feels like watching someone finally be allowed to stop. Here's why this matters for our theory about Godwyn. If Malekith was specifically tasked with guarding destined death, and if that power was smuggled out and used to kill Godwyn regardless, then someone with either extraordinary skill, extraordinary authority, or extraordinary trust had to be involved in getting it out. This isn't a case of some random thief slipping past a careless guard. This is a case of the most tightly controlled, most dangerous secret in the entire Golden Order's arsenal ending up in exactly the right hands, at exactly the right moment, to accomplish exactly the outcome that, as we discussed earlier, may have ultimately served Mareka's own long-term goal of breaking the Golden Order she built. I keep circling back to this pattern because I think it's the actual core of why Godwyn's death is so much more disturbing than it initially appears. Everything about how it happened suggests coordination at the highest levels, dressed up as either a rogue assassination or a succession dispute gone catastrophically wrong. The knife came from inside. The demigods who could have stopped it were present and didn't. The queen who could have prevented it or avenged it instead used it as the springboard for the single most world-altering act of her entire reign. None of this reads like chaos. It reads like architecture. Now let's connect this forward to the endgame of Elden Ring itself, because I think this is where the true scale of Godwyn's death finally becomes visible. By the time the player reaches the final stretch of the game, the central conflict has crystallized around destined death and what to do with it. The player, having gathered the great runes of the various demigods and confronted Malekith, ultimately obtains access to destined death itself and can choose, through the different ending paths available, what role death should play in the new order being built. Some endings restore death fully to the world, allowing the natural cycle of true, permanent ending to return, undoing the artificial eternity Mareka and Godfrey imposed generations ago. Other endings preserve various forms of the old order's denial of death in different configurations, depending on which allegiances and choices the player has made throughout the story. This entire in-game choice, arguably the central philosophical question the whole game is building toward, only exists because Godwyn's death cracked the door open in the first place. Before his murder, death was a sealed, theoretical absence, something the Golden Order simply didn't have to reckon with, because it had successfully removed the possibility entirely. After his murder, death became something the world had to grapple with again, whether it wanted to or not. Scarlet rot spreading, Mohg's blood cult flourishing on an endless supply of undying, bleeding remains, Marika's own faith shattering to the point where she broke the ring herself, Malekith reduced to a guilt-ridden guardian of a secret he failed to keep. Every single one of the game's major endings, the choice the player is ultimately given about what kind of world to leave behind, is, in a very real sense, a direct response to the question Godwyn's death first forced open. Now that death is back, now that eternity has been proven breakable, what do we do with that knowledge? Do we try to fully restore true death to the world, accepting endings, decay, and mortality as necessary and healthy, even if painful? Do we try to seal it away again, rebuilding some version of the golden, undying order that failed so catastrophically the first time? Do we burn the whole Erdtree down and start over completely, rejecting the golden framework altogether in favor of something built on frenzy, or on the stars, or on some other principle entirely? Godwyn didn't choose any of this. He didn't ask to be the crack that let death back into the world. He was golden, beloved, and by every account we have, innocent of the political maneuvering that surrounded and ultimately consumed him. And yet his death becomes the fulcrum the entire remaining narrative pivots on. Every major faction, every major demigod's arc, every major ending the player can pursue, traces back in some fashion to that one moment in the deathbed dream. A moment so significant it's literally preserved as a dream you can walk through, generations later, still frozen, still unresolved, still radiating consequence outward into everything that follows. Let's talk about the frenzied flame for a moment, because I think there's a case to be made that even this, arguably the single most chaotic, most world-ending force in the entire game, has a thread connecting it back to the instability Godwyn's death introduced. The frenzied flame, worshipped by outcasts in the depths of the world, represents a kind of philosophical opposite to the Golden Order. Instead of imposing rigid, eternal, unchanging structure, it seeks total, indiscriminate erasure, the burning away of all distinction, all order, all difference, reducing everything and everyone to a single unified chaos. It's terrifying precisely because it offers a kind of freedom from the Golden Order's control, but at the cost of obliterating everything, including the self, including any hope of a meaningful, ordered world afterward. The Frenzied Flame has existed in some form for a very long time, predating Godwyn's death. This isn't a case where I'm claiming his murder created it out of nothing, but the game strongly implies that the Frenzied Flame's influence and reach grew substantially in the wake of the Golden Order's weakening, feeding on the desperation, grief, and disillusionment of a world that watched its supposedly eternal, unbreakable order prove itself hollow. Every crack that formed after Godwyn's death, the shattering, the demigods' wars against one another, Mohg's blood cult, millennia's rot, the general disintegration of Lindell and the capital itself, created more space, more suffering, more disillusioned and desperate people for the Frenzied Flame to reach and consume. You can see this most directly in Lindell itself. In the capital city you explore for hours during the mid to late game, where entire sections of the city have been consumed by frenzy, its citizens driven mad, burning from within, their eyes replaced by the telltale flame that marks those who've succumbed to it completely. This isn't a city that was always like this. This is a city that fell apart, piece by piece. In the years following Godwyn's death and the shattering that followed it, the Golden Order's own capital, its most sacred and central location, slowly consumed by the exact chaotic force the Order was built to oppose, because the Order itself had already been cracked open by the murder of its most beloved son. I want to pause here and make sure I'm being fair to the uncertainty in all of this, because I think it matters. Elden Ring almost never tells you directly this caused that. What it does is give you fragments, item descriptions, environmental details, boss placements, dream sequences, and trust you to assemble them into a coherent picture. The connections I'm drawing here between Godwyn's death and the spread of Scarlet Rot, the weakening of the Golden Order, the growth of the Frenzied Flame's influence, and the eventual shattering are interpretive. They're strongly supported by the pattern of evidence, but they're not stated outright anywhere in a single unambiguous line of dialogue or text. Other interpretations exist, and I'd encourage you to look into them and form your own view rather than taking any single video, including this one, as the final word. What I do think is much harder to argue against is the basic shape of the horror itself, a demigod killed with a weapon that shouldn't have existed, in front of family who didn't stop it, whose body couldn't properly die because the entire world had been engineered to prevent death, and whose remains have spent the years since being actively, ongoingly exploited by one of his own siblings. That part isn't really up for interpretation. The game shows you Mohgwyn Palace. It shows you the Blood River. It shows you Godwyn's rotting animated corpse rising as a boss fight beneath the Erdtree. Those are facts of the game world, not speculation. The speculation is in the why. And I think the why, the idea that this wasn't random, that it may have served purposes far larger than a simple succession dispute, that Marika herself may have needed this exact wound to open in order to finally break the world she'd trapped herself and everyone else inside, is what turns Godwyn's death from a sad character beat into something genuinely unsettling to sit with. Let's shift focus now and talk about Ranni specifically, because I don't think we've given her role in all of this quite enough attention yet, and her motivations deserve a much closer look. If this kind of deep dive lore breakdown is the sort of thing you enjoy, it genuinely helps the channel a lot if you subscribe. I put a lot of hours into pulling these threads together, and it's the easiest way to make sure the next one actually reaches you, instead of getting lost in the algorithm. Okay, Ranni the Witch is, by most fan and community readings, the demigod most directly implicated in orchestrating Godwyn's death. She's also, notably, one of the demigods you can ally with over the course of the game, and one of the few whose full questline gives you extensive direct insight into her actual goals and philosophy, rather than leaving her almost entirely to inference the way characters like Mohg or Malekith are left. Ranni was born as Radagon's daughter with Rennala, making her part of the second generation of Marika's children, distinct from Godwyn, Morgott, and Mohg, who were born from her union with Godfrey. From a young age, Ranni was marked as a potential vessel for continuing the Golden Lineage's control over the Elden Ring, but she rejected this fate outright, going so far as to orchestrate a plan to abandon her own body, her original physical form, and take up a doll's body instead. severing herself as thoroughly as possible from the destiny the Golden Order tried to impose on her. Her stated goal, made explicit through her questline, is to shatter the Elden Ring, destroy the destiny it enforces, and usher in a new age of stars, an age defined not by the golden, controlling eternity of the Erdtree, but by something quieter, colder, and free of the enforced hierarchy the demigods have spent generations fighting and dying over. She wants to become an Empyrean capable of reshaping the ring on her own terms, and she needs an Elden Lord, ultimately, the player character, or Blade, or EG, depending on how her questline unfolds, to stand beside her and enact this new order. If we take Ranni's stated philosophy seriously, then her involvement in Godwyn's death starts to look less like petty rivalry and more like calculated, ideologically motivated sabotage. Remember, the Elden Ring, as it existed under Marika's original design, was stable specifically because true death had been sealed away from it. That stability is exactly what Ranni needed to break in order to have any hope of reshaping the ring into something new. A ring without death is, in a sense, an unbreakable ring. Nothing within it can truly end, which means nothing within it can truly change either. You can't build a new age out of a world that refuses to let the old one finish dying. So if Ranni needed a catalyst, something capable of demonstrating, decisively and irreversibly, that permanent death had returned to the world, then orchestrating Godwyn's murder using a weapon infused with destined death itself isn't a random act of violence. It's the single most efficient way to crack the foundation of the entire system she was trying to dismantle. Kill the Golden Favorite. Kill him with the one thing that shouldn't exist. Force the world to confront, in the most visceral way possible, that eternity is no longer guaranteed. This reframes her presence in the deathbed dream, calm, still, seemingly unbothered by the violence unfolding around her, not as coldness or indifference, but as resolve. She's not shocked because she planned this. She's not intervening because intervention was never the point. She's watching the mechanism she engineered finally activate, watching the crack she needed finally open in the world's foundation. And this is, I think, part of what makes her later alliance with the player so quietly unsettling if you think about it too hard. By the time you meet her, generations later, she's charming, dry-witted, strategic, and genuinely likable in a lot of ways. One of the more beloved companions across the entire questline structure of the game. But she is also, almost certainly, one of the architects of her own brother's murder, a murder that seeded scarlet rot, fed Mohg's blood cult, cracked Marika's faith beyond repair, and plunged the entire Lands Between into generations of war and decay. She got what she wanted, the world broke, and now she's asking you to help her finish the job and build something new on top of the wreckage. I don't think the game asks you to condemn her for this, necessarily. Elden Ring is deeply resistant to simple moral framing throughout its entire runtime, and Ranni's philosophy, however coldly it was executed, isn't presented as simply evil. The Golden Order she was rebelling against was, by every measure we've discussed throughout this video, a slow-motion catastrophe of denied death and enforced eternity, poisoning the world it claimed to protect. Maybe breaking it was necessary. Maybe there was no version of this story where the Golden Order simply reforms itself gently from within, without some catastrophic external shock forcing the issue. Maybe Godwyn's death, horrifying as it is, was always going to be the price of any real change. But that doesn't make it less disturbing to sit with. It just makes it more complicated. Because it means the beloved companion you fight alongside for most of your playthrough, the one whose ending is often considered one of the more hopeful, good conclusions available to the player, got there in part by using a forbidden weapon to murder her own brother, and standing calmly by while it happened. Let's talk about Rykard too, because his involvement complicates the picture even further, and his own fate afterward is almost darkly ironic given everything we've discussed so far. Rykard, Lord of Blasphemy, is another of Radagon and Renala's children, and by every account we're given, one of the more openly cruel and self-serving of the demigods. Where Ranni's involvement in Godwyn's death seems tied to a genuine, if ruthless, philosophical goal, Rykard's motivations read as much more straightforwardly ambitious, a demigod who saw an opportunity to weaken a rival, destabilize the succession order, and position himself for greater power in the aftermath. Rykard's own eventual fate is almost poetically grim. He ends up consumed, literally, physically, by the god-devouring serpent, a being he attempted to use and control for his own ends, only to be absorbed into it entirely, becoming a monstrous, serpentine fusion of man and god that the player eventually has to fight and kill deep within Volcano Manor. Whatever role Rykard played in Godwyn's death, whatever ambitions he thought he was serving by participating in it, ended with him quite literally devoured by his own hunger for power, transformed into something barely recognizable as himself, guarding a manor built on betrayal and murder for hire, run by his own loyal but morally compromised followers. There's something worth sitting with in the fact that of the demigods most directly implicated in Godwyn's death, none of them end up in a straightforwardly triumphant position. Ranni's path requires the player's direct intervention and years of manipulation and waiting to even become possible. Rykard is consumed by his own ambition in the most literal sense imaginable, and Marika herself, whose silence and inaction enabled the whole event, ends the game fused with Radagon in a broken, fragmented, barely coherent state, her body split and scattered across the capital, her mind seemingly shattered by the same act she may have needed to happen. It's almost as if the game is quietly suggesting that even a necessary catastrophe, even a death that may have served a larger purpose in breaking a genuinely broken system, still exacts a price from everyone who touches it. Nobody gets away clean. Not the ones who wielded the knife, not the ones who watched, not the mother who let it happen. The wound Godwyn's death opened doesn't heal for anyone, and it doesn't spare anyone either, no matter how justified their reasoning might have been at the time. Let's take a step back now and talk about the wider implications of all this for how we understand the Lands Between as a setting, because I think Godwyn's death teaches us something important about the entire structure of the world Elden Ring is built on. If you're just joining partway through, or if you've drifted off and come back, go ahead and drop a comment now with where you're watching from and what the time is on your end. I know this is a long one, and I appreciate everyone sticking with it this far. Let's keep going. I think one of the reasons Godwyn's death resonates so strongly once you actually dig into it, is that it functions almost like a diagnostic tool for the entire world of Elden Ring. It reveals in a single concentrated event everything that was already wrong with the Golden Order, everything the Order was trying to hide from itself, and everything that would eventually cause the whole structure to collapse into the fractured, decaying lands between the player actually explores. Think about what the Golden Order actually promised. Eternal life for the Golden Lineage, a fixed, unchanging hierarchy with the demigods at the top, Marika and Godfrey above them, and everyone else, tarnished, omens, ordinary people, sorted into categories of worth beneath them. A world where death, decay, and true ending simply didn't apply to those deemed worthy of golden favor. On paper, this sounds like paradise. In practice, as the game shows you across dozens of locations, item descriptions, and NPC stories, it produced a world quietly rotting from the inside, populated by beings who couldn't properly die, couldn't properly change, couldn't properly move forward, trapped in a kind of stagnant eternity that only looked like stability from the outside. Godwyn's death breaks this illusion in the most direct way possible, because it happens to the one figure who should have been most protected by it. If the golden, beloved favorite of the entire Order can be killed, permanently, irreversibly, in a way the Order's own rules say shouldn't be possible, then the promise at the heart of the Golden Order was never real to begin with. It was always fragile. It was always one weapon, one betrayal, one crack away from failing. Godwyn's death doesn't just cause the Golden Order's collapse. It reveals that the Golden Order was never as solid as it claimed to be in the first place. This is why I keep describing this event as more terrifying than it initially seems, rather than simply sadder or more tragic. It's not just an emotional gut punch, it's a structural revelation. It tells you, if you're paying attention, that everything you've been told about the stability and permanence of this world is a lie. A carefully maintained illusion that one assassination was enough to shatter completely. And I think this connects to something important about how the game frames the player character too. You arrive in the Lands Between as a Tarnished, one of the exiled, grace-abandoned outcasts the Golden Order cast aside specifically to prevent them from ever challenging the Golden Lineage's claim to power. For most of the game's history, prior to your arrival, that exile was permanent and total. Grace didn't return to the Tarnished, meaning they had no path back to relevance, no way to challenge the Order that had discarded them. But Grace does return, at the exact moment the game begins, specifically because the Elden Ring has been shattered and Godwyn, the once untouchable golden favorite, has died. The very same catastrophe that broke the Golden Order and plunged the world into war is the catastrophe that makes your entire journey possible in the first place. Without Godwyn's death, without the shattering it precipitated, you would still be exiled, grace abandoned, irrelevant, stuck outside the story entirely. His death is, in the most literal sense, the reason you have a story to play through at all. That's a strange thing to sit with, honestly, the player character's entire arc, from Grace abandoned exile to potential new Elden Lord. Capable of reshaping the entire world according to whichever ending path you choose, is built directly on top of the wound Godwyn's death left behind. You're not just investigating his death as an outside observer, you're the direct beneficiary of it. Every great rune you collect, every demigod you defeat, every choice you make about what kind of order to build in the end, only exists as an option available to you, because that one assassination, generations ago, cracked the world open wide enough to let someone like you back in. I don't think the game asks you to feel guilty about this. Exactly, you didn't kill Godwyn. You didn't conspire with Ranni or wield the black knife. But it's worth acknowledging the uncomfortable structural truth underneath the entire adventure. Your rise to potential godhood is built on a foundation of someone else's murder, someone else's endless bleeding, someone else's rotting, undying corpse tangled in the roots beneath the capital you eventually conquer. The game doesn't force you to reckon with this directly, but it's there, in the background, the whole time, if you choose to look for it. Let's talk now about a few of the more obscure threads connected to Godwyn's story that don't get anywhere near as much attention as Mogwyn Palace or the Deathbed Dream, because I think they add important texture to the overall picture, specifically the Deathbirds and the Fell God's Vessel. The Deathbirds are a strange, unsettling enemy type scattered throughout the world, enormous, skeletal, avian creatures that appear at specific points, often near locations connected to death and decay, in which the player has to fight in fairly disorienting, high-stakes encounters. Their exact origin and purpose is left almost entirely to environmental implication, but several fan and community readings connect them to destined death itself, creatures that emerged or were empowered specifically in the aftermath of death's return to the world, drawn to and feeding on the concept in some capacity. If that reading holds, the Deathbirds represent another ripple effect of Godwyn's murder, not a direct, traceable consequence like Mohg's blood cult or the Erdtree's inability to process his corpse, but something more diffuse, the world itself producing new strange phenomena in response to the reintroduction of true permanent ending. Death had been absent for so long that when it returned, however violently and however specifically targeted at one person, it didn't stay contained. It seeped outward into the fabric of the world, producing new creatures, new dangers, new manifestations that the Golden Order's original design never anticipated, because it never anticipated death returning at all. This is, I think, part of why so much of the world outside the immediate capital feels so unstable and strange by the time the player arrives. Not just politically fractured from the demigods' wars, but metaphysically strange, full of half-understood phenomena that don't map cleanly onto the Golden Order's original cosmology. Death came back, and the world has been quietly, unevenly adjusting to that fact ever since, in ways both large, the shattering, the wars, the rot, and small. Strange new creatures like the Deathbirds appearing at the margins, unaccounted for by anyone's original plan. The Fell God's Vessel and related Fell God iconography scattered throughout certain late-game areas connect to a similarly obscure thread, implications of an older, more primal force tied to death and destruction that predates even the Golden Order's rise. Something that the Golden Lineage's entire project of denying death may have been specifically designed to suppress and contain in the first place. If that's the case, then Godwyn's death and the reintroduction of destined death into the world isn't just breaking something Marika built, it's potentially reawakening something even older, something the Golden Order's entire existence was quietly, defensively organized around keeping buried. I want to be careful here, because this is genuinely one of the more speculative threads in Elden Ring's lore, and I don't want to overstate how confident we can be in connecting the Fell God imagery directly to Godwyn's specific death. But the broader pattern holds regardless of how far you're willing to follow this particular thread. Godwyn's murder didn't happen in isolation. It happened within, and in response to, and in continuation of, a much older, much larger set of tensions about death, order, and what the Golden Order was built to suppress in the first place. His death isn't the beginning of the story. It's the moment a much older story finally broke through the surface of the one Marika had spent centuries carefully maintaining. Let's bring this back to something a little more grounded though, because I don't want to lose the emotional core of this and all the cosmic scale implication. Let's talk about what Godwyn's death actually meant, on a human level, for the people who loved him. Because even in a story this vast and mythic, That part still matters, and I think it's easy to lose sight of it underneath all the metaphysics. We've spent a lot of this video on the political architecture behind Godwyn's death, the metaphysical consequences, the way his murder functioned almost like a lever that Marika, Rani, and others pulled to break a system they'd all, for different reasons, come to see as untenable. But underneath all of that scale and structure, there's still a much simpler, much more painful story here. A family lost someone. Not everyone in that family was complicit in the decision, and the grief that followed, however it manifested, was real. Miquella, Malenia's twin brother, is one of the demigods most clearly, consistently associated with warmth, empathy, and a genuine desire to help and heal the people around him, in stark contrast to the ambition, cruelty, or coldness that defines so many of his siblings. Across the game's many item descriptions and quest lines connected to him, Miquella is characterized as someone who has spent much of his existence trying to protect and care for those he loves. Most visibly Malenia, whose scarlet rot he spent essentially his entire life trying to find a cure for. We don't get extensive direct material connecting Miquella specifically to Godwyn's death and its aftermath, but it's worth considering what it must have meant for someone characterized this consistently as caring, gentle, and protective to lose a brother, the golden, beloved brother, no less, to an assassination plotted and carried out by other siblings, using a weapon smuggled out of the family's own most dangerous secrets, while other family members stood by and watched. If Miquella's entire character arc is built around trying to protect and heal the people he loves, then Godwyn's murder represents one of the most fundamental failures of that mission imaginable. A failure that happened before Miquella could do anything about it, orchestrated by people he presumably trusted, using tools that should never have left their vault. Miquella's own later path, his eventual attempt to become an Empyrean, to reshape the world according to his own vision of a compassionate, healing order free of the old Golden Order's cruelties, can be read, at least in part, as a response to exactly this kind of failure. A demigod who watched his family destroy itself from within, who watched a beloved brother murdered and left to rot beneath the very tree meant to protect him, deciding that he needs to build something different, something that wouldn't allow this kind of violence and betrayal to happen again. Morgott too deserves mention here, another of Godwyn and Mohg's siblings, born, like Mohg, and Omen, and like Mohg, denied his birthright and hidden away because of it, though Morgott's path diverges sharply from his brother's. Rather than descending into the kind of grotesque, obsessive cult building we see from Mohg, Morgott instead takes up the mantle of protecting Landel itself, holding the capital together, by force and by will, in the absence of any clear leadership after Mareka's withdrawal and the chaos that followed the shattering. When the player finally reaches him, deep within Lindell, he's fighting not for personal glory or ambition, but out of what reads as genuine, exhausted duty, trying to hold together a city, a legacy, a family that has already fundamentally, catastrophically failed. There's something worth sitting with in the fact that of Godwyn's siblings, the two Omens, Mohg and Morgott, both denied their birthright, both hidden away and shamed by the very order Godwyn embodied so perfectly, end up representing two radically different responses to that same core wound of exclusion and loss. Mohg descends into obsession, exploitation, and a monstrous bid for the legitimacy he was always denied, quite literally feeding on his murdered brother's remains to fuel his ambitions. Morgott, instead, chooses to hold the line, to protect what's left, to shoulder a burden that was never fairly his to carry, out of something that looks a lot like love for a family in a city that, by every reasonable measure, failed him first. I think this contrast matters because it complicates any simple reading of Godwyn's death as just an abstract, world-shaking metaphysical event. It had human consequences, sibling consequences, family consequences that played out differently depending on who was affected and how they chose to respond. Some siblings, like Rani and Rykard, appear to have been active or complicit participants in the killing itself, pursuing their own political and philosophical goals. Others, like Mohg, exploited the aftermath for personal gain. Still others, like Morgott and possibly Miquella, seem to have been left picking up pieces they never asked to be responsible for, trying to hold together fragments of a family and a kingdom that had already fundamentally come apart. And then there's Marika herself, whose grief, if we can even call it that, remains the most obscured, most ambiguous piece of this entire puzzle. We've spent a lot of this video building the case that her inaction and her subsequent decision to shatter the ring suggests something closer to allowance or even intention than simple grief-stricken paralysis. But I don't think those two things are necessarily mutually exclusive. It's entirely possible to read Marika as someone who needed Godwyn's death to happen, who saw no other path to breaking the world she'd trapped everyone inside, and who was also, simultaneously, devastated by the loss of her most beloved son. Necessity and grief aren't opposites. Sometimes the most painful choices are the ones made because there was no better alternative, not because there was no pain involved at all. If Marika's final message to the player, the fragmented, exhausted plea for a new Elden Lord to finish what she couldn't, to change the world, to build something other than the frozen eternity she'd spent centuries maintaining, is read through this lens, it becomes almost unbearably sad rather than simply calculating. A mother who let, or made, an impossible choice, sacrificing her most beloved child not out of coldness, but out of a desperate, exhausted belief that it was the only way to eventually give everyone else, her other children, the Tarnished, the entire lands between, a chance at something better than what she'd built. Whether or not that belief was justified, whether or not it actually worked, is left entirely to the player to decide, through which ending they ultimately choose to pursue. This is, I think, the emotional center of gravity underneath everything else we've discussed today. Godwyn's death is terrifying because of the scale of its consequences. The rot, the blood cult, the shattering, the collapse of an entire metaphysical order. But it's also terrifying, in a much quieter and more intimate way, because of what it says about the choices a family, and a mother, might be capable of making when they've convinced themselves there's no other way forward. That's not a uniquely mythic horror. That's a very human one, dressed up in golden light and demigod politics, but recognizable underneath all of it. Let's spend some time now going back through the physical locations connected to Godwyn's story, the Deathbed Dream, the Deathroot Depths, Mogwyn Palace, and look more closely at the specific environmental and visual details the game uses to tell this story, without ever stating it outright, because I think there's a lot more to find here if we slow down and look carefully. Let's go back to the Deathbed Dream itself, because I don't think we actually looked closely enough at what's physically inside it, and there are details in there that get skipped over even by people who've walked through it a dozen times. When you first enter it, the space doesn't behave like the rest of the game. Time is frozen, the camera drifts through fog. The figures inside, Ranni, Rykard, Radon, others, are static, unreactive, locked into postures rather than performing an active scene. This matters because it tells you something about what kind of memory this actually is. It's not a recording of the event itself, moving forward in time the way a cutscene would. It's a held breath, a single instant, stretched out and preserved, the way a photograph holds 1/24th of a second forever. Someone, or something, chose to preserve exactly this moment. Not the moment before, not the moment after, but this one, specifically. And that choice tells you what the moment meant to whoever or whatever encoded it into a dream that can still be entered. And notice who isn't frozen in violence. Nobody in that dream is mid-swing. Nobody is recoiling. There's no blood actively spraying, no scream caught mid-throat. The horror of the Deathbed Dream isn't kinetic, it's atmospheric. It's the stillness of people who already know what's about to happen, who are past the point of shock, standing in a kind of ceremonial hush. That's not what a chaotic assassination looks like. That's what a ritual looks like. And I think that word, ritual, is worth sitting with for a moment, because it reframes the entire scene. A ritual implies foreknowledge. It implies agreed upon rules. It implies that everyone present understood, beforehand, what they were there to do or to witness. Radon's presence in that dream is one of the details I think gets undersold the most. Radon, when we eventually meet him in the present timeline, is gravely, deliberately holding a rotting battlefield in stasis through sheer force of will and Scarlet Rot-resistant physical dominance, refusing to let time or decay move forward around Caelid. A demigod obsessed, in his own arc, with control over time and stasis. His presence in a dream that is itself frozen, unmoving, held outside of ordinary temporal flow, stops looking like coincidence once you know that about him. It starts looking like thematic doubling. The same demigod who spends his adult life fighting to physically arrest decay was present at, maybe even complicit in, the one moment that proved decay and death could never fully be arrested again. There's a bitter irony buried in that placement that the game never explains, but never needed to. It's simply there, for you to notice or not. Let's talk about what you don't see in that dream, because absence is doing a lot of work here too. Marika isn't in the Deathbed Dream. Neither is Godfrey. Neither is Miquella or Melinia or Morgott or Mohg. Only a specific subset of Godwyn's siblings are present, the ones most closely tied to the philosophical rebellion against the Golden Order, the ones who had the most to gain from the world's stability cracking. That selective presence is, on its own, a kind of confession. If this had simply been a chaotic, unplanned assassination, you'd expect witnesses to be random, whoever happened to be nearby. Instead, the guest list reads like a conspirator's roster. Now let's go deeper into the Deathroot depths, because I don't think we spent enough time on the actual texture of that location the first time around. And there's a lot happening architecturally and sonically that reinforces everything we've already discussed. The Deathroot depths are enormous, one of the largest connected spaces in the game, and they're built almost entirely around root structures branching in every direction, vast enough that you can lose your sense of scale entirely while traversing them. This is deliberate. The roots aren't just scenery, they're the physical manifestation of the Erdtree's reach, extending far below the world most people ever see, into a space that's simultaneously the foundation of everything above, and a place almost nobody living ever goes. Godwyn's body sits at the deepest, most enclosed point of this entire network, not near an entrance, not somewhere passers-by might stumble on him. He's placed at the literal root of the root system, the innermost point the Erdtree's reach extends to, which tells you that whatever process drew his body down there wasn't random drift. It was gravitational, in a metaphysical sense, as if the Erdtree itself was pulling the one true death in generations as deep into itself as it could manage, trying, and failing, to metabolize something it had no framework for. The music and sound design down there matters too. It's hushed, watery, distant, less a dungeon and more a drowned cathedral. And the enemies you encounter on the way to Godwyn's body are notably ancestor spirits and animal adjacent, deer-like guardian beings tied to older, more primal nature worship than the Golden Order's structured architectural religion. This is another one of those quiet details that appears when you look at the Deathroot depths and notice what kind of world existed underneath and before the Golden Order's rise. The roots don't just lead to Godwyn's corpse. They lead through a layer of the world that predates the Golden Hierarchy entirely. Spirits and totems from something older, something the Golden Order built itself on top of and in some sense buried, that's worth pausing on, because it complicates the picture we built earlier. Godwyn's body isn't just resting in Erdtree territory. It's resting in a liminal zone between the golden, structured religion of Marika's making and whatever came before it, animistic, spirit-based, rooted in something older and less controlled. If Destined Death being reintroduced into the world through his murder cracked the Golden Order's foundation, it's worth noting that his body physically ended up exactly at the seam between that foundation and whatever lies beneath it. Not a subtle placement once you notice it. When you finally reach him, the fight that unfolds, depending on your progress, either the regal ancestor spirit guarding the approach or the full confrontation with Godwyn's corrupted remains, reframes everything visually that we've discussed only in the abstract so far. His corpse doesn't look peaceful. It doesn't look like a body at rest. It looks assembled, almost architecturally, into something that resembles less a fallen king and more a load-bearing structure that has been slowly, methodically stripped for parts. There's a passivity to it, even in its horror. It's not raging. It's not lashing out with intent. It's decaying in place, animated by something closer to residual current than will. The way a downed power line can still spark long after the tower it was attached to has collapsed. Now let's go back to Mohgwyn Palace, because I think there's a layer of detail in that location we skipped past too quickly, and it changes how we should read Mohg's entire relationship to what he's built. The first thing worth noticing, if you slow down while approaching the palace rather than rushing toward the boss fog, is how the architecture actually communicates ownership. This isn't a space Mohg conquered from someone else and repurposed. It's built specifically, from the ground up around the blood source, every hall, every platform, every enemy placement oriented toward and around that central river. The way a temple orients itself around an altar. Mohg didn't stumble onto Godwyn's bleeding corpse and decide to make use of it opportunistically. He built an entire civilization around it. Followers, architecture, a functioning theology, an economy of worship. That takes time. Generations of time. In a world where demigods live far outside ordinary human timescales. Which means Mohg has been doing this, quietly, methodically, away from Lindell's notice or at least its intervention, for an extraordinarily long stretch of the story's unseen history. And that raises a question that doesn't get asked nearly often enough. How did nobody stop this? Marika withdrew. Morgut held Lindell together by main force, but Godwyn Palace, an entire functioning cult built on the body of the royal family's most beloved son, operated in the open for what appears to be a very long time, without the capital ever moving against it. Either the capital didn't have the strength to intervene, which tells you something about how far the Golden Order's authority had actually crumbled beneath its surviving formalities, or the capital knew and simply didn't act, which tells you something considerably darker about how little anyone left in power actually cared what was happening to Godwyn's remains once the political usefulness of his death had already been extracted. I lean toward reading this as the latter, and here's the detail that pushes me there. Moog is an omen. Omens are explicitly structurally cast out by the Golden Order, hidden away, denied inheritance, treated as evidence of impurity rather than as members of the family. If the capital was actively hunting Moog's cult, actively trying to stop the desecration of Godwyn's body, that would at least suggest the Golden Order still cared enough about its golden son's dignity to intervene. The fact that this doesn't appear to happen, that Moog is left, for as long as the game implies, undisturbed to build an entire blood economy out of his brother's corpse, reads less like an active decision and more like abandonment through indifference. Nobody with the power to stop it thought it was worth stopping. Godwyn's body had already served its purpose. What happened to it afterward simply wasn't anyone's priority anymore. That's a colder read than the Golden Order didn't know, and I think it's the more consistent one, given everything we've already established about how deliberately absent Marika's response to the murder itself was. Let's look at the specific ritual Moog is attempting more closely too, because the mechanics of it are worth slowing down on. The stated goal, using an Empyrean bound to Godwyn's remains to birth the formless mother, a Lord of Blood, isn't just villain wants power. It's specifically an attempt to manufacture legitimacy through inheritance. Moog isn't trying to seize the Elden Ring by force, the way Rykard's ambitions seem oriented, or by ideological rupture, the way Ranni's are. He's trying to birth his way into the golden lineage's structure, to create, through this monstrous union, an offspring of sorts that would carry both Godwyn's golden blood and Moog's own claim, forcing the Golden Order to recognize a legitimacy it always denied him for the accident of his birth. Think about what that means layered on top of everything else. Moog isn't just exploiting his brother's corpse for raw material. He's trying to use it to solve the exact wound that shaped his entire life. The fact that he was born marked, cast out, denied. He's attempting to graft his own bloodline onto Godwyn's golden legitimacy through violence, quite literally trying to manufacture the acceptance the Golden Order refused to give him naturally. It's monstrous. It's also, in its own twisted way, coherent with everything we know about who Moog is and what was taken from him. He's not doing this out of nothing. He's doing this because the same system that killed and abandoned Godwyn also spent Moog's entire life telling him he wasn't worthy of the golden blood he shares. There's a version of reading Godwyn Palace that sees it purely as villainy, full stop, and the game doesn't ask you to forgive what he's doing there. The ritual, if completed with an unwilling Empyrean, is framed unambiguously as violation. But it's worth noticing that Moog, Ranni, and Marika herself are all, in their own separate ways, trying to solve the same underlying problem, a golden order that enforces a rigid, closed hierarchy of who gets to matter, who gets to inherit, who gets to be golden. Ranni tries to shatter that hierarchy entirely and build something new outside it. Marika tries to break it from within at catastrophic personal cost. Moog tries to force his way inside it, using the one resource he has access to. His murdered brothers endlessly renewing blood. None of them get a clean outcome. But the pattern is worth naming, because it tells you Godwyn's death didn't just create one story. It created a kind of gravitational field that pulled multiple, radically different characters toward the same unresolved question. What do you do with a world whose foundational promise, golden, eternal favor, has just been proven false? Everyone left standing after his murder is, in some sense, answering that question with their own life's work, whether it's Ranni's stars, Marika's shattering, or Moog's blood-soaked attempt to force his way into a family that never wanted him. I want to turn now to something we only touched on briefly earlier, the return of grace to the Tarnished, and the 2 fingers and 3 fingers who oversee it, because I think this thread connects to Godwyn's death more directly than it first appears, and it's rarely framed this way. The 2 fingers are the Erdtree's own instrument for selecting and guiding potential Elden Lords, operating out of the Round Table hold in a space that exists somewhat outside ordinary geography. the way the Deathbed Dream does. They're old, genuinely old, in a game where old carries enormous metaphysical weight, and their entire function, recalling Tarnished from exile, restoring their grace, setting them on a path toward the Elden Throne, only activates once the ring has shattered. Before the shattering, this function simply isn't needed because succession isn't in question. The Golden Order has its heirs. It doesn't need outside candidates. So the Two Fingers' entire operational purpose is downstream of Godwyn's death in the most direct sense possible. No death, no instability significant enough to force Marika's hand toward shattering the ring. No need for the Two Fingers to reach outside the Golden Bloodline entirely and start recalling Exiled. Grace abandoned Tarnished from the far reaches of the world. Every single NPC you encounter throughout the entire game who is also a Tarnished, also drawn back by Grace, also competing for the same throne you're competing for, is there because of the same originating wound. This is worth sitting with, because it reframes basically every companion and rival you meet throughout your playthrough. Melina, the various NPC questlines, every other Tarnished wandering the lands between hunting great runes. All of you are here specifically because Godwyn died in a way the Golden Order's own rules said was impossible. Melina's situation is worth lingering on specifically because her connection to the Erdtree and to Godwyn's family runs closer than most. Multiple implications scattered through her dialogue and item descriptions across the game connect her in some fashion to Marika's bloodline, whether as a fragment, a vessel, or some other liminal category the game deliberately keeps ambiguous. If Melina is understood as connected to the Erdtree's own will, or to some splinter of Marika's own consciousness, then her presence walking alongside the player for most of the game, guiding them toward the same throne Godwyn might once have expected to inherit, takes on an additional layer of quiet grief. She's not just a guide. She may be, in some fractured sense, family, walking beside the very kind of outsider the Old Order would never have recognized, doing for a Tarnished what nobody in the Golden Lineage was ultimately willing or able to do for each other. The Frenzied Flame's presence within the Three Fingers connects here too, and I think it's worth being precise about how, because it's easy to conflate the Two Fingers and the Three Fingers as simply good guiding force and corrupting alternative, when the actual relationship is stranger than that framing allows. The Three Fingers exist in the same space as the two, physically closed, described as another remnant of the Greater Will's original undivided form, not a separate invading force, but something more like a rejected or unintegrated part of the same source. If that's accurate, then the Frenzied Flame isn't purely external chaos threatening the Golden Order from outside. It's something the Golden Order's own foundational power produced and then refused to acknowledge, sealed away in the same underground spaces the Two Fingers occupy, the same way Destined Death was sealed away and guarded by Malekith. Notice the pattern repeating. Destined Death, removed from the ring, hidden, guarded, eventually escaping its containment, and killing Godwyn. The Frenzied Flame, present within the same divine structure that produced the Golden Order, hidden, sealed, available to any Tarnished willing to seek it out and let it in. Both represent things the Golden Order needed to deny, bury, and control in order to maintain its own coherent self-image as a stable, eternal, orderly system. Both eventually leak back out into the world regardless. Godwyn's death is the moment Destined Death broke containment. The player's own choices throughout the game determine whether the Frenzied Flame breaks its containment too, through the ending path that embraces total, indiscriminate erasure rather than any form of restored or renewed order. This is, I think, one of the more elegant pieces of structural design in the entire game once you notice it. The two most dangerous, most heavily sealed powers in the Lands Between's entire cosmology are both things the Golden Order tried to solve by hiding rather than resolving. And the entire back half of the story is the consequence of that strategy failing, first with Godwyn, and potentially again with you, depending on which ending you choose to pursue. Let's go back to Caelid and the Erdtree, because I think we moved through the Scarlet Rot connection too quickly earlier, and there's more specific, traceable detail worth pulling out. Caelid's devastation is usually attributed, in broad community understanding, to the Battle of Aeonia, a war fought specifically to contain and destroy an early, catastrophic outbreak of Scarlet Rot in the region, a battle so severe it left the entire landscape permanently scarred, crimson, and hostile even generations later. This detail matters for our theory because it establishes something important about timeline. The Aeonia outbreak isn't described as happening after Godwyn's death in every reading. Some interpretations place it earlier, or roughly concurrent, which complicates a simple Godwyn died. Therefore, rot began causality. I want to be honest about that complication rather than smooth over it. Because I think the more accurate and more interesting reading isn't that Godwyn's death single-handedly created scarlet rot from nothing. It's that scarlet rot as a phenomenon may have already existed in some form. The world's suppressed capacity for decay and true ending, seeking any crack it could find, and that Godwyn's death didn't originate that crack so much as it blew it wide open. Aeonia may have been an early tremor, Godwyn's corpse beneath the Erdtree, feeding directly into the world's central life tree structure rather than staying contained to one region, may have been the moment that same underlying force stopped being containable to a single battlefield and started spreading through the world's actual root system. This reading is supported, I think, by how differently the two instances of rot behave. Aeonia's outbreak, catastrophic as it was, stayed geographically bounded, devastating, but contained to Caelid. Whatever is happening beneath the Erdtree in the Deathroot depths connects, through the root network, to essentially everywhere. The Erdtree's roots aren't local. They're described and shown throughout the entire game as reaching beneath the whole of the lands between. If Godwyn's rotting body sits at the heart of that network, then the containment logic that kept Aeonia's outbreak from spreading everywhere simply doesn't apply anymore. The infection has access to the entire circulatory system of the world's central tree. Malenia's specific condition deserves another look through this lens too. She's afflicted from a young age, which on a strict timeline might place her infection before or around Godwyn's death, rather than clearly after it. Another point where I want to be honest about the uncertainty rather than force a cleaner narrative than the evidence supports. But here's what I think is less ambiguous. Whatever the origin of her personal affliction, her condition and the rot's broader spread across the lands between both intensify, according to the environmental and narrative texture we're given, in the same general era as the shattering and its aftermath. Whether Godwyn's death caused her rot or simply coincided with and then dramatically worsened the same underlying phenomenon that was already inside her, the practical effect on her life is the same either way. She spends her adulthood fighting a losing, exhausting war against something that traces back, in one form or another, to the same wound in the world's fabric that killed her brother. The Erdtree itself, Miquella's answer to all of this, deserves a closer look too. Built specifically as an attempt to cure Malenia, a private, secluded, almost desperate architectural project, a second tree grown apart from the Erdtree's authority, meant to offer some alternative to the rot consuming his sister, the Erdtree ends up just as devastated, just as rotted, as everything else by the time the player reaches it. Even Miquella's most focused, most personal attempt to solve the consequences of this era's spreading corruption fails. The tree meant to be an antidote becomes another ruin. That failure, I think, is one of the most quietly devastating details in the entire late game, because it tells you something important by this point in the story. The rot isn't a problem you can architect your way around. It's not a disease with a cure waiting to be found if you're clever or devoted enough. It's become load-bearing, structural, baked into the world's fundamental condition in a way that even a demigod's private, isolated, loving effort to build something apart from the broken system couldn't escape. That's the shape of consequence we keep circling back to throughout this whole discussion. Godwyn's death, whatever its precise causal relationship to every specific instance of rot and decay across the lands between, marks the point after which containment stops being possible anywhere. Not in Caelid, not in the Erdtree, built specifically as a sanctuary from exactly this kind of corruption. Not even in Lindell, the capital itself, which we'll get to in more detail shortly. Everything eventually rots, and the game keeps drawing your attention, gently but insistently, back to the roots beneath the Erdtree as the place where that rot seems to originate, or at least concentrate most intensely, back to the body of the Golden Sun who was never allowed to properly finish dying. Let's walk through Lindell itself now, because I think the capital is where all of these threads converge most visibly, and there's a version of this city that only becomes legible once you're specifically looking for Godwyn's fingerprints on it. The first time you enter Lindell, before the in-game state where it's been consumed by fire and flame, it presents itself as the Golden Capital in its most intact, most functional form left in the entire game. Towering spires, golden light, the Erdtree looming overhead close enough to feel less like scenery and more like weather. And yet even here, in the most preserved seat of the Golden Order's remaining authority, the wrongness is everywhere if you slow down and actually look at what's around you, rather than moving through it toward the next boss fog. The grand lift of Dectus and the approach into the capital are guarded heavily, more heavily than almost anywhere else in the game, which on its own tells you something about how precarious the people actually holding the city feel their position to be. This isn't the defense posture of a confident, stable order. It's the defense posture of people barricading themselves into the last real stronghold they have left, aware on some level of how much has already been lost outside the walls. Once inside, the enemies you fight are telling in their own right. Erdtree soldiers, still nominally loyal, still fighting under golden banners, but increasingly indistinguishable in behavior and desperation from the frenzied, feral enemies found elsewhere in the world. And scattered throughout the city, particularly as you move deeper toward the inner capital. Entire pockets of the population have already succumbed to the frenzied flame. Burning eyes, burning skin, driven past reason, attacking anything that moves, including, in some cases, each other. This isn't background texture. This is the Golden Order's own capital city, the physical seat of the Order that Godwyn was supposed to be the golden symbol of, already hollowing out from the exact chaotic force that Order was built to suppress. Morgott's rule holding this together deserves another look here too, because I don't think we gave it enough specific weight earlier. When you finally reach him, first as Margit, disguised, testing you before you're even meant to know his real identity, and then later as Morgott himself, revealed. Defending the capital's innermost sanctum directly, his fight is framed with a heaviness that most demigod encounters don't carry. He's not presented as a tyrant to be triumphantly overthrown. He's presented, through his dialogue and through the sheer exhaustion baked into his design and his arena, as someone who has been holding a collapsing structure together through will alone. For what the game implies has been a very long time, entirely without help, entirely without relief, entirely without any of the golden favor that Godwyn was given so effortlessly, and that Morgott, as an omen, was denied from birth. There's a bitter symmetry worth naming directly. Godwyn, golden, beloved, effortlessly favored, is dead, killed by a weapon that shouldn't exist. His death cracking the world open. Morgott, hidden, shamed, denied his birthright specifically because of how he looked, is the one left standing in the wreckage, holding the capital together with nothing but stubbornness and a curved blade, because nobody else was left, or willing to do it. The Golden Sun gets a dream preserved in his memory, walked through by the player as something close to sacred. The Omen Sun gets to die again, alone, at the top of a crumbling capital, fighting a Tarnished who's simply passing through toward a throne he was never allowed to sit on either. I don't think this is incidental storytelling. I think it's the game quietly, consistently making the same point across multiple characters. The Golden Order's promise of golden, eternal favor was always selectively distributed, always resting on categories of who counted as worthy and who didn't, and Godwyn's death is simply the most dramatic, most consequential proof that even the most favored recipient of that promise wasn't actually protected by it in the end. If golden favor couldn't save Godwyn, it was never really protecting anyone. It was just a story the Order told about itself, right up until the moment reality proved otherwise. The fire that eventually consumes Lindell in the endgame, whichever specific narrative path leads you there, reads differently once you've walked through this whole chain of consequence. It's not really a new catastrophe striking the capital from outside. It's the final visible stage of a decay that's been running underneath the golden surface the entire time, starting, as far as this whole analysis has tried to trace it, from a knife that should never have existed, used against a demigod who should never have been able to die, in front of family who chose not to stop it. Let's talk about the Great Runes mechanic itself for a moment, because I think there's something worth noticing in how the game actually handles Godwyn's absence from that system, and it's easy to miss because it's expressed through an absence rather than through anything stated outright. Every other major demigod you defeat over the course of the game drops a Great Rune, a fragment of the shattered Elden Ring, carrying that demigod's specific inherited power, which the player collects and eventually uses to restore the ring itself. Godric's, Radon's, Rykard's, Morgott's, Renella's, Millennia's, Moog's, Millennia's again through Miquella's connection. The entire in-game structure is built around gathering these fragments, and each one carries the specific flavor of the demigod it came from. This is, mechanically, one of the clearest ways the game communicates who these people were and what they represented, translated directly into player-facing systems and stat bonuses. Godwyn doesn't have one. There's no Great Rune of Godwyn to collect. No fragment of the ring carrying his specific inheritance sitting out there waiting for the player to claim. And once you notice this, it becomes one of the more quietly unsettling structural details in the entire game, because it means Godwyn's piece of the Elden Ring, his portion of the golden inheritance, the fragment that should exist corresponding to the golden favorite, The demigod the entire order held up as its purest symbol is simply missing from the in-game central collection mechanic entirely. Where did it go? The game doesn't tell you directly, which by now should be an unsurprising sentence to hear about anything connected to Godwyn's story specifically. But given everything we've discussed, the Black Knife, destined death. The way his death fundamentally broke the mechanism that made the Elden Ring stable in the first place. There's a reading available here that I think is worth taking seriously. Godwyn's portion of the ring isn't missing by accident. It may be that his death, specifically because it was a true death rather than a defeat, removed his fragment from the cycle of collectible, redistributable power entirely. Every other demigod, when defeated, still yields something. Their power gets passed on, gathered, reused. Godwyn, killed rather than defeated, yields nothing collectible. His piece of the golden inheritance simply isn't there to be found, because true death, the thing that was used against him specifically, doesn't work the way defeat works in this world. It doesn't transfer, it ends. This gives the in-game's entire structure a kind of quiet, permanent gap at its center. No matter which ending you pursue, no matter how completely you gather every other demigod's great rune, there's a hole in the collection that can never be filled, corresponding exactly to the one demigod who was actually permanently killed, rather than merely defeated in battle. The mechanics of the game are, whether intentionally designed this way or not, reinforcing the thematic point we've spent this entire discussion building. Godwyn's death is different in kind, not just in degree, from everything else that happens to every other demigod across the story. Everyone else gets defeated, and their power redistributes. Godwyn died, and something about the world's ability to process and redistribute power broke in exactly the place his portion should have been. I think this connects back to why Godwyn's corpse specifically becomes such fertile, contested ground. For Mohg's cult, for the rot spreading through the roots, for the general instability radiating outward from the Deathroot depths. If his portion of the golden inheritance didn't cleanly transfer the way it should have, didn't become a tidy, collectible great rune the way everyone else's did, then it had to go somewhere. It didn't vanish. Power in this world doesn't simply cease to exist. It's possible that what Mohg is actually harvesting in that endless river of blood beneath his palace isn't just symbolic vengeance fuel or cult iconography. It may be the closest thing that exists to Godwyn's missing great rune, his inheritance, uncollected and uncontained, leaking out of his body in the only form it has left available to it, because the orderly mechanism that should have processed it properly simply isn't built to handle a true death. Let's return to Marika and Radagon now, because I don't think we spent enough time on the specific mechanics of that fusion, and I think there's a detail in there that bears directly on our theory about her allowing or even needing Godwyn's death to happen. Radagon, as we get it late in the game, isn't simply Marika's husband in any conventional sense. He's described and eventually shown to be an aspect of Marika herself, split off, given independent form and consciousness, sent out to marry into and bind together fractured pieces of the world, including his union with Rennala at the Academy of Raya Lucaria, which produced Ranni, Rykard, and Radon. This means Marika, in some fundamental sense, was her own son and daughter-in-law's parent through two entirely separate identities operating simultaneously. She fathered Ranni, Rykard, and Radon as Radagon, while she mothered Godwyn, Morgott, and Mohg as Marika. And both of these were, on some level, she herself may not have fully processed or reconciled, the same being. If that's true, then the plot against Godwyn, carried out substantially by Ranni and Rykard, her children through the Radagon aspect, takes on an even stranger character. It's not simply siblings against a sibling. It's one fragment of Marika's own fractured selfhood, acting through Radagon's lineage, moving against another fragment of her own children, born through her Marika identity. The murder of Godwyn isn't just a family betrayal in the ordinary sense. It's something closer to self-harm distributed across a divided psyche. One part of a single being's fractured consciousness turning against another part of that same being's own creation, in a conflict so internally contradictory that it's hard to imagine Marika, whichever aspect of her was aware of it at the time, experiencing it as anything other than a kind of civil war within her own fundamental nature. This might explain something that's otherwise difficult to account for, why Marika's response reads as fragmentation rather than as a single coherent reaction. If Godwyn's death wasn't just the loss of a child, but functionally an act of self-directed violence carried out through one half of her own divided identity against the product of her other half, then shattering the Elden Ring afterward isn't really a strategic decision made by a stable, unified consciousness weighing costs and benefits. It's closer to what happens when something fundamentally, structurally can't hold itself together anymore and simply breaks apart, because the contradiction at its center has finally become too great to sustain. The shattering, read this way, isn't purely Marika's chosen instrument for reforming the world. It's also, simultaneously, the visible symptom of a being whose fractured internal structure had just been forced to confront the fact that it had, in some sense, participated in killing its own child. This reframes something else too. The Elden Beast, the final form the player confronts at the very end of the game, described as something closer to the physical embodiment of the Greater Will's design. The entity that has been guiding and shaping the Golden Order's entire structure from outside, or perhaps from within, the Elden Ring itself. If the Greater Will is the actual source of the Golden Order's design, the enforced eternity, the denial of true death, the rigid hierarchy of golden favor, then Marika, and by extension Radagon, were never fully independent actors. They were instruments, extraordinarily powerful instruments, capable of building and ruling an entire world, but instruments nonetheless, carrying out a design that originated somewhere beyond even their own considerable will. If that's the case, then Godwyn's death sits at an even stranger intersection than we've discussed so far, possibly necessary from Marika's own personal, fractured perspective as a way to break a system she'd come to see as a prison, but also potentially a failure or a rupture from the Greater Will's perspective, the exact kind of true permanent death that the entire Golden design was built specifically to prevent from ever happening again. Marika may have needed Godwyn to die in order to break free of the Greater Will's design. And if that's true, then his death isn't just a family tragedy or a political maneuver. It's an act of rebellion against a god, carried out using that same god's own son as the necessary casualty. I want to be careful here again about how far we can responsibly push this, because the relationship between Marika, Radagon, and the Greater Will is one of the most contested, most interpretively open areas in the entire game's lore, and different community readings weigh the evidence differently. But the broader shape of what I'm suggesting holds regardless of exactly how much independent will we attribute to Marika versus how much was already dictated by forces beyond her. Godwyn's death sits at the exact fracture point between a mother, a divided self, and possibly a god whose design was already starting to fail long before that black knife ever found its way into an assassin's hand. Let's go back to the Black Knife assassins themselves for a while, because I don't think we gave this faction nearly enough dedicated attention earlier. And there's more here than mysterious killers who did the deed. The Black Knife assassins operate almost entirely outside the normal social and political structures we see everywhere else in the lands between. They don't hold territory the way Volcano Manor does. They don't have a public-facing cult the way Mohg's followers do. They exist as a rumor, a shape glimpsed at the edge of an encounter, a name invoked more than a faction actually seen operating in the open. This matters, because it tells you something about what kind of organization was capable of both possessing destined death and being willing to use it on Marika's own son. This isn't a faction that wanted recognition or credit or political advantage from what they did. Whoever they answer to, whatever their actual chain of command is, they were content to carry out one of the most consequential acts in the entire history of the lands between, and then simply fade back into obscurity, unclaimed, unpunished, essentially unaccounted for by the rest of the story going forward. That anonymity is worth sitting with. If Ranni orchestrated Godwyn's death as part of a considered philosophical project to break the Golden Order, and if the Black Knife assassins were her instrument for doing it, then their willingness to vanish afterward without seeking credit or reward tells you something about the nature of their loyalty. This wasn't a mercenary transaction. This was closer to devotion, an organization willing to carry out an act this taboo, this world-altering, purely in service of someone else's vision, without needing the recognition that most factions in this world seem to crave in one form or another. We also know, through weapon item descriptions scattered across the game, that Black Knife-type weapons appear tied to multiple different assassins across the story, not a single unique blade used once and retired, but something closer to a technique, a tradition, a repeatable method for weaponizing destined death that the assassins clearly have some ongoing, functional access to. This detail matters because it undercuts a simpler version of the theory where a single, uniquely dangerous weapon was smuggled out on one occasion and used against Godwyn specifically. Instead, it suggests an organization with genuine, sustained access to destined death as a raw resource, which loops back to Malekith's role as its guardian, and raises the same uncomfortable question we asked earlier, except now with more weight behind it, if the Black Knife Assassins have ongoing. Repeatable access to a power that's supposed to be sealed away and guarded by one of the Golden Order's most loyal and severe instruments, then either Malekith's guardianship has been compromised on more than one occasion, or the leak was never really a leak at all. It was a permission granted quietly by someone with the authority to grant it, and simply never revoked. I keep returning to this framing because I think it's the detail that separates a genuinely unsettling reading of Godwyn's death from a merely sad one. A single betrayal, a single stolen weapon, a single moment of failure on Malekith's part. That's tragic, but it's containable. It's an accident that spiraled, what the evidence actually seems to suggest. Once you look at the Black Knife Assassins as an ongoing faction with sustained access rather than a one-time anomaly, is something closer to an established, tolerated exception to the Golden Order's own rules, a controlled channel through which destined death could be selectively deployed, when necessary, by people operating with either explicit or deliberately unexamined permission from somewhere very high up. That's not an accident. That's infrastructure.